Today's podcast on Paradise Earth will delve into the history of one of the most influential and yet most poorly understood religions of the world, and that would be the ancient Aryan faith of Iran and Central Asia, known in the present day as Zoroastrianism. This tradition has had perhaps as much impact on Western civilizations as religions of Near Eastern origin, since it has widely been acknowledged that a substantial portion of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim beliefs can be traced, in fact, from historical creeds of the Zoroastrians. For example, the notion that the world is a battleground for the forces of good and evil, and that we, as mortals for the moment, share a role in this cosmic disorder, is a viewpoint that can be traced to prehistoric Zoroastrian cosmology, and believes that this ongoing rivalry between good and evil spirits will eventually culminate in a final clash between a creator god and his adversary on earth, a satanic figure, so to say, is actually another Zoroastrian article of faith, along with their anticipation of a messianic figure that will lead the Aryan nations against the devil and his followers at the end of time. These enduring expectations of Persian societies were well known to early Greek and Roman philosophers, long before Greek and Byzantine Christians adopted similar mythical views and themes. But that's not all, because the Zoroastrians also anticipate a final day of reckoning in which the world's creator will determine whether or not the bodies and souls of our fellow human beings will spend eternity in heaven or in hell. This particular prospect was likely adopted by Hebrew tribes during the age in which a Zoroastrian king, a king by the name of Koresh, saw fit to release the Jews from bondage in Babylon, following his triumph over Nebuchadnezzar 600 years before the dawn of the Christian era. Zoroastrian communities have also left their mark on Buddhist societies of Central Asia, since members of this closely related Aryan tradition have always paid devotions to many of the same gods and goddesses. And like the Zoroastrians, Central Asian Buddhists similarly await a messianic figure in the future, a future Buddha, if you will, who will lead humanity to paradise during an apocalyptic end of the current so-called Buddha Eon, a title that he shares, in fact, with an apocalyptic sun god figure in Zoroastrian tradition, who is also known as Mithra, an Iranian pronunciation of the Buddhist name Maitreya. But first and foremost, Zoroastrians have always placed most of their devotions in a single creator spirit by the name of Ahura Mazda, a god whose name means literally Lord Ahura of Wisdom Mazda. This god of creation is also recognized as the future final judge of humankind on both a personal and collective basis, a role which this spirit and a number of lesser gods and goddesses assumed in support of Ahura Mazda and Aryan agriculturalists and pastoralists of Persia and Central Asia. Even though most of these divinities were also worshipped by Aryan tribes of India, the Indo-Aryans, their divine tasks in Persian and Central Asian mythology, Zoroastrian mythology, are recognizably different from those of their Indo-Aryan cousins to the east. Same names, many similar attributes, but distinctly different mythic roles. Now, it might go without saying that the term Aryan has a much different meaning today than it did in the past. And we can thank the historical commentaries of German scholars and Nazi propagandists during the first half of the 20th century for our unfortunate modern usage of the term today. because the word Arya originally referred to a clan-based brotherhood of self-proclaimed, noble, and ethical, God-fearing cattlemen. And not unlike the Aryans of ancient India, related tribes of Iran and Central Asia have never had any significant interactions with Germanic peoples in the past, even though they did enjoy early and enduring commercial, military, and cultural contacts with the Egyptians, with Mediterraneans, Mesopotamians, and Indians. And we have around 4,000 years of religious and historical texts that vouch for their early and unprecedented successes in affairs of state, which again have absolutely no bearing whatsoever on the political history of Northern Europe. Those were not the original Aryans. What we are particularly interested in today is a widely shared Zoroastrian belief in the promise of paradise at the end of a person's lifetime, and the critical role in which the use of a psychotropic drink made from a psychotropic plant played in preparing humanity for their entrance, their admittance into the land of the gods, into paradise. The botanical, I should say, identity of this plant is still debated by linguists, even if this plant had a surprisingly wide distribution in antiquity, when it ranged from the Caspian Sea to the upper reaches of the Ganges River basin. Like Brahmins of India, Perso-Aryan priests would share swigs of this mind-altering plant extract and experience a foretaste of what life might be like in the realms of paradise. So the Perso-Aryans adopted this euphoric sacrament as a key component of their liturgies and religious rituals, during which they would lift up their voices to give thanks for their elevated moods and unique sense of spiritual awareness. The sacred plant that was involved in similar rituals in India was known as soma in the language of Sanskrit, a topic that we explore in considerable depth in our separate episode on Soma and the Vedas on Paradise Earth. And it is widely assumed that the same plant species was employed in similar shamanic rituals by West Asian speakers of the Aryan languages known as Avesta, Pahlavi, and Parthian, all of whose speakers referred to the plant as either home, the home plant, or haoma, obviously cognate with the Sanskrit term soma. Consequently, it is a well-known but often neglected fact that Western civilizations owe more than a small debt to the impacts of a narcotic plant in the birth and spread of religious traditions among Indo-European peoples, as much as 2 millennia before the dawn of the Christian era. There are several historical explanations for the disappearance of Zoroastrian practices and societies in southeastern Europe and Central Asia. One relates to the reticence of Perso-Aryan priests and warriors to pay any sort of deference, much less respect, to foreign powers that sought control over their lands and affluent civilizations throughout history. The soldiers of Alexander the Great, for example, followed by various Arabic caliphs many centuries later, expressed a recurrent desire to simply annihilate the uncooperative priest guilds and soldiers of Iranian societies, this resulting, eventually, in a mass exodus of fractured Zoroastrian communities from the Middle East and Central Asia to the west coast of India around 1,200 years ago. And so, most viable Zoroastrian communities now prosper, albeit in small numbers, in the states of Gujarat and Maharashtra on the western flanks of modern India, not so far from the modern city of Mumbai. As history would have it, wave after wave of foreign armies saw fit to destroy a substantial portion of the scriptural records of the Zoroastrians, which left their faithful followers and historians alike with mere remnants of what was once a very rich and widely distributed mythic tradition. This being the case, the reconstruction of Zoroastrianism's historical past might be likened to attempts at reassembling a massive jigsaw puzzle with about half of its pieces missing. Glaring gaps in our understanding of the faith have given rise to a number of differing opinions on the meaning of Perso-Aryan mythology, just as the same can be said for differing interpretations on iconographic imagery from ancient Iranian ruins. Nevertheless, 2 centuries of steady progress in the fields of archaeology and linguistics provide ample information to reconstruct a general framework of the religion, especially when analyzed in light of beliefs and religious practices that were conserved assiduously by their fellow Indo-Aryans in South Asia. The famous Persian priest and prophet that is credited with the founding of the faith, namely Zarathustra of the Spitama tribe, plays a prominent role in Perso-Aryan mythology. While most scholars would probably agree that this man played a critical role in Persian history, records on the prophet's life read a lot like that of the latest Buddha, which pretty much defines his life in terms of mythic themes. In fact, the name of the faith to which Zarathustra belongs, Zoroastrianism, is based on a Greek mispronunciation of the prophet's name, Zarathustra, whom the Hellenes referred to as Zoroaster. So the term Zoroastrianism actually has no historical basis in traditional scriptures of the Perso-Aryans, because the followers of Zarathustra have always referred to their faith in terms of their creator spirit, Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom. Thus, Iranian priests referred to their tradition as Mazda Yasna, which means Mazda worship Yasna. And they would refer to their dedicated followers then as Mazda Yasnians, worshippers of Mazda, not of Zarathustra. So while the role of their prophet, Zarathustra, is a focal theme in many mythical sources of the tradition, we encounter actually no specific historical references to the man outside of just a few scriptural sources, which is to say that there are no references to Zarathustra on temple walls, inscriptions, or royal edicts, or on objects of art. Archaeological evidence of Zoroastrian ways of life begins relatively late, some 2,600 years ago, which would be many centuries, if not millennia, after the prehistoric hymns of the Zoroastrians were already circulating across the Aryan expanses of Central Asia during prehistoric time periods. Yet interestingly, while archaeological records from around 2,500 years ago are chock full of references to Mazda-worshipping kings, their foreign adversaries, and of course to various gods and goddesses of their populated pantheon, we never encounter, as I said, references to Zarathustra among temple and palace grounds that served the ambitions of Iranian kingdoms at the height of their influence. This is really quite curious. So I will try to avoid, for the most part, the use of the term Zoroastrianism as much as I can, and stick with the tradition's preferred terminology, Mazda Yasna, lest we distract our attentions from the religion's true focus. We have done no less, for example, in rejecting the use of the term Mohammedism for Islam, since the prophet Muhammad, much as Zarathustra, was a revealer and messenger of the divine word rather than its ultimate source. And in this same light, we might also recognize a number of alternative names for a variety of Zoroastrian sects, including such terms as Magianism, in reference to the beliefs and practices of Mazda-Yaznian priests of northern Iran, the Magi, hence Magianism, or another common term, Mithraism, which refers to the worship of the Persian sun god Mithra, a close associate of Ahura Mazda. Other commentators of antiquity would often refer to the Perso-Aryans as fire worshippers, quote unquote, since their disparate tribes, much as their Indian cousins, traditionally employed fire altars in their ritualized Homa drinking ceremonies. Of course, modern-day Christians are familiar with references to the Magi in the New Testament, often referred to euphemistically as the quote-unquote 3 wise men, or the 3 kings of the Orient, who followed a divine ray of starlight, of course, from the heavens of the Orient to locate Jesus Christ as a newborn baby in Bethlehem. And these 3 Magi journeyed from afar in order to present the special child with offerings of frankincense, gold, and myrrh. So these Magi are likely referred to as wise men in the Bible because they worshipped the Lord, Ahura, of wisdom, Mazda. And we now know that during the advent of the Christian era, a rather heterodoxic form of Mazda worship was adopted by Roman soldiers, who actually worshipped a prominent member of the Mazdian Pantheon by the name of Mithra. That would be Mitra in Sanskrit, of the Indians, a Persian sun god and a close associate of Ahura Mazda. The Romans referred to Mithra as well, reverentially, as Sol Invictus, meaning the invincible sun. Mithraism might be recognized, therefore, as one of the original religions of the Roman state. Once it grew in popularity throughout Europe and Asia Minor from the 2nd to 4th centuries AD. It may even come as a surprise to some listeners that early Christians portrayed their messianic figure, Jesus the Nazarene, in the image of the Persian sun god Mithra, with an aura of golden rays emanating from his head. Moreover, they celebrated Christ's birthday on what was formerly Mithra's birthday during the winter solstice, of course, that being Christmas. And they shifted their Jewish day of worship, a Saturday, to a Sunday for the worship of Jesus, which was the day in which they formerly worshipped Mithra, the sun god. The switch of Constantine, the famous Byzantine emperor, from Mithraism to Christianity during the 4th century happened rather abruptly and under historical circumstances that are still not well understood. But a stark reminder of this transfer of religious power can be found among the foundations of the Vatican itself, because they were originally established to sustain a temple dedicated to Mithra. All of these later developments in the spread of Mazda worship can be traced from the mountain ranges of Baluchistan and the Hindu Kush of modern Pakistan and Afghanistan many centuries, if not millennia earlier, which have historically presented a daunting geographic barrier between Persia and India, but hardly an insurmountable obstacle. Because in all actuality, the high peaks and steep valleys of the Hindu Kush have never actually deterred the movements of pastoralists between Europe and Asia during Asia's prehistoric past. This is evidenced nowadays by the well-documented intermingling of Caucasian genomes of Southern Europe with genomes of Central and South Asia over the course of the last, it would seem, 40,000 years, based on genetic evidence. A full millennium before Cyrus the Great, a well-known Iranian king, ascended the throne around 2,600 years ago, we find evidence, written in stone, for the worship of several Indian-Aryan gods among people of ancient Turkey, these being the Hittites and the Mitannians. Inscribed references to such Indian gods as Indra, Mitra, Varuna, and the Nasatya twins along the eastern boundaries of Europe, whose names are almost exclusively known from prehistoric hymns and mythic tales of the Vedas from India during this age, are a source of constant fascination for modern historians. The basis for this unexpected disjunction of Aryan deities between Europe and Asia still remains a mystery, because two of these Indian gods were actually recognized as adversaries of Ahura Mazda in classical scriptural records of the Perso-Aryans. So, whether a small Indian community wandered to the southeastern fringes of Europe in a single dispersal event at this early juncture in history, 3,600 years ago, or perhaps represent ancient worshippers of Indra, Mithra, and Varuna that once enjoyed a widespread and continuous distribution across the plains of Central Asia during the second millennium BC, may never be known with certainty on account of scanty archaeological records. But whatever may be the case, it is widely recognized that regional developments of Aryan religious traditions, be they of Indian, Persian, Central Asian, or Eastern European provenance, must have sprung from the same cultural source. And since many prehistoric gods and mythic themes span the ancient ranges of Aryan tribes from the Caspian Sea to the Ganges Delta, there is little disagreement that a steady ebb and flow of nomadic tribes across the southern flank of Eurasia is responsible for the widespread influences of prehistoric Aryan traditions. Many centuries of cultural diffusion must have preceded the ascension of the famous king of the Achaemenian dynasty, Cyrus the Great, around 2,600 years ago. This famous emperor's name, Cyrus, is actually a Greek bastardization of the sovereign's original family name in Avesta, the language of Avesta, which would be Kurush, whom the Hebrew tribes of Judah refer to as Koresh. Trade and cultural intercourse between the East and West was somewhat limited in scope until Cyrus the Great succeeded in bridging the long-standing geographic and political divides between Europe and Asia. After doing so, his immediate descendants marched their armies across various southern outposts of Europe and throughout Central Asia from the 5th to the 3rd centuries BC in military campaigns that resulted in the unprecedented feat of establishing a cohesive military state from the Mediterranean Sea and the upper Nile River to the Punjab of northern India. These achievements naturally fomented economic and cultural exchanges between fully developed civilizations of the Mediterranean, of Egypt, the Near East, Mesopotamia, Iran, and India. And this development, as might be expected, set the stage for a host of religious cults and beliefs to spread across civilized societies that had in the past been isolated. And we can only assume that the use of the haoma-plant during this era had the same distribution as Persian armies and their famous outposts. The kingdom of Kurush was administered by a succession of equally capable kings and generals with comparable aspirations, among whom are included the famous Macedonian general Alexander the Great, various Roman emperors, such as Trajan and Menander, followed eventually by a series of Arabic caliphs many centuries later. And as history would have it, a considerable number of these foreign soldiers and subjects adopted various religious beliefs and practices of their Mazda-Yazdian associates, while also sharing their own cultural and religious dispositions with Aryan societies. Like so many cultures of this age, Perso-Aryan peoples revered a number of naturalistic deities, but two prominent members of the Pantheon command more attention than the others, one being, first and foremost, Ahura Mazda, a creator spirit and the father of the Iranian Pantheon, and a closely related sun god of somewhat lesser stature, Mithra by name, who assisted Mazda in upholding the good laws of his natural creations. The fact that these two gods share similar physical and mythical attributes with various members of the Vedic Indo-Aryan Pantheon has long been acknowledged by historians as has the fact that the oldest scriptures of ancient Persia are preserved in the Avestan language, which is linguistically very close to archaic forms of Sanskrit and related languages of India. Much like Vedic bards of prehistoric India, priest guilds of ancient Iran celebrated their religious ceremonies by means of hymns that were known collectively as either yasts or gathas. The Avestan word gatha is cognate with the Sanskrit term gita, both terms meaning song. And it's widely agreed that the Persian gathas were originally part of an enduring oral tradition that was apparently committed to script around the time of the Achaemenian period. So like the Vedas of India, the religious hymns of the Persians were recorded in a script that followed and conserved the archaic usage of Avestan words and syntax. These prehistoric songs are cosmological in scope, and as most historians agree, they were originally epical in scale. Unfortunately, what is left of Gothic records is woefully incomplete, because a majority of the songs were put to fire by enemies of Mazda-worshipping priests over the course of history. It has been estimated, for example, that as little as 25% of the original collection of archaic hymns survived the tests of time, thereby leaving modern students of the faith with a very incomplete picture of the earliest cosmological views embraced by the original founders of the tradition. But fortunately for our interests, and for these discussions, a number of scriptures and liturgical commentaries that were conserved in various Indo-European and Semitic dialects during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, many centuries later, do in fact afford a more comprehensive picture of the traditional Perso-Aryan worldview from later periods of Zoroastrian history. These more derivative scriptural records now comprise what one might refer to as the Mazda worshippers' canon, various texts of which provide sufficient detail to consider and compare the similarities and differences between beliefs of early Perso-Aryan societies and the beliefs of the same societies during later time periods, not to mention the beliefs that they shared with peoples of ancient India. The earliest known scripted myths, doctrines, and liturgies of Mazda worship date from around 3,000 years ago, and these differ, as one might expect, from those that were authored just 1,000 years ago. So historians must investigate common religious themes and practices that were shared between these distant time periods to ascertain the more fundamental and enduring religious precepts of Mazdianism. And the same can be said for comparing the common themes of Indo- and Perso-Aryan religious traditions across Asia's vast corridors of trade and contacts. Depending on the geographical source and timing of surviving texts, different deities take center stage in Perso-Aryan mythology and iconography. But as a whole, Mazda-Yazdian scriptures reveal a polytheistic tradition that worshipped a subset of gods that once comprised a substantial complement of India's Vedic pantheon. Both traditions celebrate, for example, the mythic exploits of Mithra, a sun god, Apam-Napat, a water spirit, a god by the name of Trita, and various dragon-slaying personas. These widely popular Aryan divinities sharing similar roles in sustaining cosmic battles between dark, subterranean serpent demons and heroic, sun-like celestial deities. The heavenly host on the side of Ahura Mazda can assume the mythic forms of solar eagles, fertile and retting bulls, combative horses, rams, and personified golden-eye warriors that course across the heavens on chariots of gold. And not unlike the sky gods of Indian Aryan traditions, Persian sky gods also habitually vanquish and quell the powers of demons that live in the dark underworld of rivers and lakes. However, the outcomes of these recurrent battles are different in Persian mythology than in Indian mythology. Insofar as the goals of Mazda's divine associates are to stave the natural cycles of chilling winters and withering droughts on Earth by ensuring the return of the sun and the flow of fresh and slowly moving waters across the dry lands of Central Asia. These themes are generally not visited on gods of Indian origin. The Perso-Aryan outlook on nature and the material world actually deviates, then substantially, from that of their Indian relatives. In direct contrast to Vedic tradition, Mazda worshippers identified their benevolent and righteous celestial spirits as Ahuras, as lords, so to say, as lords of the skies, which contrasts with the Vedic term for heavenly spirits, which the Indians called Daevas. So the Persians referred to their sky gods as Ahuras, while the Vedic priests referred to their sky gods as Daevas. And conversely, Mazda worshippers refer to demonic underworld figures as Daevas, while the Indo-Aryans usually categorize their demonic spirits as Asuras. So we have here a complete reversal in the nomenclature of the embattled gods of the earth and sky among the Aryans, a topic that has long been a staple of scholarly commentary. We therefore find that while a particular deity or class of gods may rise and fall in popularity among related schools of religion over the course of time, the mythic themes and cultic practices generally conserve their original meaning, as does Persia's prehistoric hymns. We find that the celestial and solar gods of Iran are often referred to in the plural as the Ahuras of Mazda. This custom is maintained throughout Zoroastrian history, since Avestan scriptures of later origin specifically recognize spirits of lesser stature, such as Mithra and Apam-napat, as Ahuras, as lords, along with, of course, the Lord of Wisdom, the head honcho. This is because Mazda, as the father of the gods and invincible leader of the Persian Pantheon, shares his own enlightening heavenly characteristics and splendorous powers of truth, known as Havareno, with his divine offspring. So Mazda's offspring are typically chips off the old block. Now, Mazda himself is a solar entity of sorts that, not unlike his Vedic equivalents, is closely connected to the life-engendering medium of still or slow-moving waters of rivers and lakes. Or more specifically, Ahura Mazda is described as a sun god of the quote-unquote threefold way, whose solar eyes are able to see and know everything. These particular attributes recall, of course, ancient Indian allusions to the Vedic plant god known as Soma, whose thrice-born eyes are omniscient and born from rivers and lakes. Or again, Mazda is a valiant, white and shining soul when seen from afar, but beautiful in form like a swift-horsed sun, they say, in the Gathas, his body and soul residing in the lofty station of the sun, according to the Dinkar. And interestingly, were I to replace the word Mazda in this description here with Soma, the statement would make perfect sense to a Vedic bard. Like the Vedic gods, Soma, Agni, and Indra, Ahura Mazda is also an archetypal Indo-European slayer of surly serpent demons, of dragons, that cause death and decay underneath the waters of rivers and lakes. And since the life-giving waters of Aryan tribes in Central Asia are identified in Persian scriptures and mythology as the wives of Ahura Mazda, and also as the mothers of Mazda's divine offspring, that would be rivers and lakes, the conflicts between the serpents and sun gods are perpetual and take place invariably in an aquatic medium, much as they do in the Vedas. The vying powers of life and death are bound to clash because this is precisely where the proverbial Mazdian tree of life, a key player in the sustenance of eternal life on earth, is also said to thrive. In fact, while preparing for these conflicts, many of Mazda's divine offspring are begotten by his riverine consorts, after which they arise from the Creator's so-called wide pastures to seek out dragon demons of their bounteous waters. And it turns out that the divine offspring of Mazda often exhibit rather curious characteristics, such as the god of fire, known as Atar, fire in Avestan, who often produces a smokeless flame, they say, as he arises from riverine waters. And I might add here that these same themes applied precisely to the contemporaneous Vedic god of fire, Agni, in ancient India. Or then there is the god known as Virathagnya, a distinctive god in his own right, whose title means literally Virathagnya, dragon slayer, the Vedic equivalent being a Vritrahan. Persian Virathagnyas often require the assistance of a plant god by the name of Homa, equivalent of Soma in Sanskrit, whose illustrious golden shoots invigorate the Aryan tribes and their cow herds and prepare them for battles against the dragons. Since Ahura Mazda is the designer of the cosmos, he would be then also the sole creator of the sacred tree of life, a plant by the name of Homa, on which the welfare of his divine children, which humankind and living creation, is eventually going to depend. The practice of crushing stalks of this holy plant to extract its immortalizing sap is described in Persian literature. In ritual, the sap of this plant was poured into golden chalices called kumbhas. That would be the kumbha of the Vedic singers of India. And these vessels were then shared among priests that were known variously as either atravans, sautars, or magi, priests basically. These men of God would then share portions of their haoma libations with the gods by tossing portions of the extract into fire as a gesture to invigorate and strengthen all of Mazda's militant supporters, gods and mortals included. So clearly, all of these roles are consonant with Vedic methods that detail the Indian practice of a soma sacrifice. The Persian tree of immortal life is described as both a weapon and as a source of prosperity for Zoroastrian traditionalists. Much like soma, the sun-like boughs of the haoma-plant sprout prodigiously on the shores of rivers and lakes and produce a sap that was regarded as the essence of living creation. As such, haoma is referred to in various textual sources of different ages as either the quote-unquote tree of all seeds, as the tree of healing, and or as the tree of immortality. These descriptive titles are attributed then, of course, to the psychotropic effects of the plant's sap, which the Persians referred to as rasa, another cognate term in Sanskrit that refers often to Vedic soma. The sap was also identified in mythic terms as the semen of the creator spirit, Ahura Mazda, gulps of which were required to restore everlasting life on earth. Persian mythology tends to focus on conflicts that result in cyclic rounds of possession, dispossession, and repossession of a shining, glowing essence, a radiant sort of energy known as havareno, which is said to emanate from both Ahura Mazda and from the haoma-plant. Tales that describe the battles to possess this glowing golden energy usually involve a group of spirits that take the form of various shining animals. But some of the longer narratives involve the assistance of a central heroic human figure, Zarathustra Spitama by name, a member of the Spitama tribe, who was the first revealer and chief priest, that would be Sautar in Avestan, equivalent to the Hotar in Sanskrit, of Mazda worshippers. Zarathustra is given the responsibility of receiving and disseminating the spiritual laws of Mazda for the benefit of humankind after sampling his own first taste of haoma-plant pressings. The prophet seems to have inherited this role by divine providence, having been conceived himself by the will of the Lord of Wisdom, Ahura Mazda, and by the means of the seed of the Creator God, as well as his life-giving Havareno energies that are passed over to the haoma-plant. Modern commentators often use the word prophet to describe the activities of Zarathustra in Mazdian myth and doctrine. This is because modern scholarship is inclined to envisage Zarathustra as an historical figure, many historians adopting this perspective from Greek authors that wrote about this foreign prophet, religious figure, several centuries before and after the dawn of Europe's Christian era. In fact, numerous celebrated luminaries of the Mediterranean world, and including the likes of Plato, Pliny the Elder, Porphyry, Diodorus Siculus, Ammianus Marcellinus, Plutarch, and Diogenes Laertius, refer to the Persian prophet nominally as Zoroaster, which, as I've mentioned, is a corrupt pronunciation of the name Zarathustra. And these classical commentators typically describe Mazda's chosen human emissary, Zarathustra, in the context of an extraordinary visionary, as a philosopher and a highly charismatic magus, a priest, which essentially acknowledges Zarathustra as the historical founder of a whole new school of religion. On the other hand, many classical authors also eulogize the prophet's role in history in somewhat divine terms. Plato, for example, identified the prophet as the son of Ahura Mazda, which I guess makes him a demigod of sorts, and yet undue attention, in my opinion, that has been placed on the prophet's human dispositions in Persian mythology often obscures the significant roles of Mazda's divine associates in these same tales. And these conversations include talking cows, dragons on the attack, and conversant sun-like sky gods. Nor do these verses fail to mention Zarathustra's unstinting support for a substantial list of riverine and celestial spirits, including spirits of the sun, the moon, Venus, as well as various divine or sacred lakes and rivers. We seem to be dealing with a truly divine figure, rather than a respected philosopher or popular priest. So I'm thinking that Zarathustra's designation as a prophet sort of misses the mark. A quick perusal of Zoroastrian scriptures identifies Zarathustra then as a mythical personage for the most part, and with divine characteristics and powers that anticipate his role and destiny in Mazda's grand plan for living creation. Generally speaking, Zarathustra follows the same fantastical footpath of many of his Indian counterparts, such as Rama, Krishna, Kamsa, and the Buddha. For like these spiritual heroes of India, Zarathustra is conceived immaculately by a mortal mother and is subsequently born as a glowingly golden child after his mother imbibes a generous portion of haoma on the banks of a sacred river, this haoma being recognized as the seed of Ahura Mazda himself. Now, scriptural sources of Mazda-Yaznians can vary in size, in content, in place of origin, and for that matter, in age of origin. The older and therefore more critical scriptural sources comprise a collection of liturgical works called the Zend Avesta. This substantial collection of religious works is preserved in the ancient language of Avestan and include interpretations of these literatures in a class of texts called the Zans, and all of these come from different time periods, hence the term Zend Avesta. Like the Old and New Testaments of Christian tradition, or the Upanishads of India, The Avesta actually comprises a collection of anachronistic records, the latest compilation of which is thought to date from around the 6th century AD, even if the works that were compiled at that time are a much older origin. So Avestan scriptures have multiple origins, and are therefore traditionally divided into 3 general classes of texts, including the prehistoric gathas, or songs, which were originally preserved by oral transmission. These records were likely composed during the 2nd millennium BC, 4,000 years ago, which is perhaps 1,000 years before later scriptural addenda were added to the Avesta, which would include then the yasnas and the yashts, these titles meaning, literally, acts of worship and hymnals. It turns out that the yashts complement the gathas as liturgical chants during the Homa sacrifice, but they were authored during later literate periods of Persian history. And the third class of texts, the zans, or commentaries, preserves some historical explanations for the songs and the mythic themes. Collectively, then, the Zend-Avesta is a record that accounts for Persian religious practices over the course of some 2,000 to 3,000 years. The oldest portion of the Avestas, as I mentioned, the Gathas, are incomplete and apparently difficult to translate by language specialists on account of their antiquity. The prehistoric language in which the Gathas were conserved has long been extinct. And to further complicate matters, the perplexing allegorical contents of Gathic mantras only compound our difficulties in their translation and in their interpretation. Gathic verses are framed completely in metaphorical and mythic terms, and they tend to focus on the spiritual travails of various symbolic creatures and spirits that inhabit the heavens. A modern reader is simply left mystified, if not completely at a loss to explain exactly what these tales are all about. But the Gathas are rightfully regarded as critical studies on the history and historical trajectory of Mazda-Yazdian belief and doctrine, not only because of their ancient standing in the tradition, but also because they contain the only known explicit quotations of conversations between the creator Ahura Mazda and his prophet Zarathustra. These dialogues cover and explain the rhyme and reasons behind the interactive relationships between the most immediate descendants of Ahura Mazda, these being a class of celestial spirit known as the Amesha-Spintas, meaning the holy immortals or the blessed immortals, all of whom must come to terms with the existential plight of a sickened mythical animal, a cow, by the name of Go-Survan. This tale seems to have been a compelling yarn, but the details of this tale have gone missing since the libraries of the Medians were put to fire by Alexander the Great. Much of what we presently know of Mazdian mythology must be garnered, therefore, from complementary materials in the so-called Younger Avesta. This group of texts, including the Yasts and the Yasnas, in addition to a variety of mythical sources that were preserved in the language of Pahlavi, an idiom that shares ancestry with Avestan, and that served as the language of choice in Iran from the 3rd to 7th centuries AD. Important among these texts is the Vendidat, a text whose title translates as Against the Daevas. This text treats the subject of cosmology and religious law in light of Daevic battles against Ahura Mazda from the earlier Avestan materials. The same can be said for scriptural sources that appear on the scene during the same age in both the language of Pahlavi and Arabic, such as the Bundahishan, or Creation of the Beginning, a text that affords a revealing and relatively comprehensive overview of Persian cosmology, theogony, and prophecies relating to the eventual fate of Mazda's creations. Two other sources of significance on these themes include the Din card, the Acts of Religions, and the Zadspurham, a text whose title refers to a Mazdian priest that compiled selections of creation myths around the 9th century AD. While a number of scholars and modern members of the faith deem some of these sources to be apocryphal and actually full of novel themes and ideas with respect to the original Gathas, these are the historical sources with which we must attempt to reconstruct our understanding of Mazda worship. Prehistoric hymns of the Zoroastrians concentrate on a singular mythic narrative that relates almost exclusively to the origin of the world and to the gods that assist the Creator in protecting everlasting life. In the Avestan language, the Mazdian pantheon sustains a metaphysical principle called asha. This term asha is conventionally translated into English as either truth, righteousness, or natural order. The equivalent concept in Indo-Aryan tradition would be dharma, or rita, or vrata, all of which terms connote a first and therefore a universal principle, generally speaking, of life. Later scriptural additions to the Avesta are usually more liturgical in content and conserve chants that were employed in rituals to ensure the welfare of Iran's pastoral communities, livestock included. In direct contrast to Indian mythology and doctrine, i.e. those of Brahmanic and Buddhist peoples, the Avesta pays minimal attention to the concept of reincarnation, which everybody knows is a foundational proposition of Brahmanic and Buddhist schools of religion. Mazda worshippers adopt instead an entirely different perspective on the natural world, beginning with their views of time, which they describe in linear and finite terms. According to one traditional text, a period of 12,000 years is the amount of time that is required to fulfill the divine plan of Ahura Mazda, once and for all, and for eternity. Devotees of Mazda believe that each and every individual has but a single life to earn his or her just rewards in the afterlife. So, truth seekers that follow Mazda's good laws can expect to spend eternity in paradise, while liars, deceits, and deniers of Mazda's all-powerful stature in the world and natural order are destined to follow demons into a hellish darkness at the end of time, where they will pass eternity under the torturous treatments of merciless fiends. So the ultimate fate of a human body and soul is determined in the end by Mazda on a final day of judgment. And this will also be experienced by evil spirits, all of whom, being dark and slithery in form, will assemble with sinful souls in an abyssal prison on earth at the end of time. This Iranian perspective on the future of the world seems hauntingly familiar to modern Christians because, well, in all likelihood, it rubbed off on exiled Jewish communities in Babylon long before Judaic communities of the Levant advanced the cause of Christian heterodoxies. It is abundantly clear that these unique perspectives on cosmic order and visions of a predicted end of time arose from the same cultic practices that inspired Brahmanic and Buddhist traditionalists, foremost among which is the employment of the haoma-plant to confer bliss and immortality upon the devotees of the Lord of Wisdom. Basically, the libation rituals of Persian priests, these being known as atravans, provided the way and means to assist Ahura Mazda in actually defeating the insidious spirits of deceit. The specific Persian term for these demons was either drug or drauga, a word that is obviously equivalent to and cognate with the Vedic term druj, either being Aryan terms that refer both in India and Central Asia to aquatic, underworld serpents. Or one might recognize just as well an etymological relationship between the Persian word drauga and the English word dragon. If you have already checked out our episodes on Soma and the Vedas, which I recommend as an introduction to our present treatment on Zoroastrianism, you will also recognize a relationship between the name for Mazdian priests, the Atharvans, and a divine Brahmanic priest of Vedic renown, known as Atharvan, whose names refer to the man's expertise in the use of sacred fires during the practice of Soma sacrifices or haoma sacrifices. And we note in the Soma episode, Atharvan is the supposed author of the Atharva Veda, one of the 4 principal Vedas. And this title fits well into the Persian context, insofar as the focal activity of Mazda-Yazdian ceremonies involved the sanctification and consumption of the liquid sacrament known as haoma, which was extracted from the haoma-plant. After a round of prescribed sips were shared among priests, mantras were sung to entreat Ahura Mazda and his celestial allies to accept a portion of their mind-altering drink. Similar to Vedic practices, a portion of the haoma sap was tossed into a fire altar as a ritualized contribution to the gods. At times, this plant was identified as a plant god by the name of Homa, and occasionally in a quasi-personified form that was willing to be sacrificed for the benefit of Mazda's followers. But another beneficiary of the haoma ritual was the sun god Mithra, a Mazdian solar deity, and also the 7 bountiful or blessed immortals, the Amesha-Spentas, often referred to as archangels in older translations, and various other divinities that shared in the libation rites. The 7 Amesha-Spentas figure prominently in both early and late scriptures of the Mazda worshippers, the most active of which was known as Vohu Mana. Now this name means literally good mind or good thought, in that this god personifies the righteous mind and intentions of Ahura Mazda. The second most frequently cited Amesha-Spentas comprise a pair of virtually inseparable archangels of the plants of the world and the clear waters of the world, namely Amritat, which is cognate with the Sanskrit term Amrita, meaning the Soma drink. This would be the archangel of plants, and Harvatat, the archangel of clear and sweet waters. These 2 bountiful immortals function essentially as twin deities, because their assistance is normally invoked as a pair of divine powers to gain favor during preparations of the haoma-plant. On a mythical level, their assistance is often requested during the sacrifice of a mythical cow by the name of Gosarvan, or cow plant, whose dying body is said to give life, to give birth to the Mazdian tree of life, haoma, in standing bodies of water.